All right, listener, ready for another deep dive? This time, we're tackling a topic that's sure to get those philosophical gears turning egoism.
Yeah, egoism. It's one of those concepts that sounds simple enough at first, but oh boy, the deeper you go. Exactly. And we know you're no stranger to philosophy, so we're not going to waste time with the egoism 101 stuff.
Nope, we're going straight to the good stuff. Think of it as, like, egoism explained to a philosopher.
I like that. So, to guide us on this journey, we've got some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, you guessed it, egoism.
Buckle up, listener, because we're about to encounter some serious nuance and debate. It's going to be fun.
Okay, so when we talk about egoism, it's not just one monolithic thing, right? We've got different types of egoism floating around.
Right, you've got your psychological egoism, your ethical egoism, and your rational egoism.
3 flavors of egoism. So, as a quick recap for those who might need it, psychological egoism is basically the idea that all our actions, even the ones that seem super altruistic, are actually motivated by self-interest. Exactly. And that one tends to ruffle some feathers because it can sound pretty cynical, like we're all secretly selfish deep down.
Yeah, it's like saying Mother Teresa was only helping the poor because it made her feel good about herself.
Which, some people might actually argue. But we'll get into the arguments for and against psychological egoism a bit later.
For now, let's just lay out the different types. So we've got psychological, then there's ethical egoism.
Right, ethical egoism, which is even bolder. It says that it's not just that we are selfish, but that we ought to be selfish. That acting in your own self-interest is the morally right thing to do, period.
Whoa, okay, that's a big one. So it's not just a description of how we are, it's a prescription for how we should live.
Exactly. And it's a really challenging view because it seems to conflict with a lot of our basic intuitions about morality.
Like helping others, even if it costs us something.
Exactly. Ethical egoism would say, why bother? Unless, of course, there's some benefit to you down the line.
Okay, so we've got psychological and ethical. What's the third one again?
Rational egoism. And this one is all about what it means to be rational. It says that the most rational thing to do is to act in your own self-interest.
So they're not necessarily saying that you will always act in your own self-interest, but that if you're being rational, you should.
Precisely. And this one gets really interesting because it forces us to think about how self-interest relates to other reasons we might have for acting.
Like moral reasons, or maybe even just practical ones.
Exactly. Does being rational always mean putting yourself first? Or are there times when rationality might require you to act against your own immediate self-interest?
Okay, so we've got these 3 different flavors of egoism. But before we dive into the arguments for and against each one, there's a big thorny question we need to tackle first.
Oh yeah, the big one. What does self-interest even mean?
Right. It can't just be whatever I feel like doing in this moment, can it? I mean, sometimes I feel like eating an entire bag of chips, but I don't think that's really in my self-interest long term.
Haha. Yeah, that's where things get tricky. Philosophers have come up with a few different ways to define self-interest. One way is called the preference or desire account.
Okay, so what does that one say?
Basically, it says that acting in your self-interest is all about fulfilling your desires, whatever those desires may be. Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, I guess so. If I want something and I get it, that seems like it's in my self-interest.
Right. But hold on a second. What about desires that aren't so obviously me-focused? Like, what if I desire to help other people? Does that count as self-interested?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, if I genuinely want to help others, even if it means making sacrifices myself, wouldn't that be a self-regarding desire? It's something I want, even if it's not about material gain or something.
Yeah, and that's where the preference account starts to get a little fuzzy. Is there some objective standard for what counts as a self-regarding desire versus one that's more, I don't know, other-focused?
It seems like you could twist almost any desire into a self-interested one if you tried hard enough. Like, maybe I donate to charity because it makes me feel good about myself, so it's ultimately about my own emotional well-being.
Exactly. And that leads us to another way of defining self-interest, the objective account.
Okay, what's this one about?
This one says, forget about desires. Let's look at states of being that are just inherently good for a person, regardless of whether they happen to want them or not.
Interesting. So we're not talking about subjective preferences anymore. It's more like these things are good for you whether you like it or not.
Exactly. And what are some of those objectively good states? Well, philosophers have debated this for centuries, but some common contenders are things like virtue, knowledge, maybe even fulfilling one's potential.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Uh-huh.
So even if I'm a total couch potato who desires nothing more than endless Netflix and snacks, the objective view might say, nope, Your true self-interest lies in developing your character and expanding your mind.
Exactly. Even if you don't feel like it, those things are objectively good for you, so they're in your self-interest, whether you realize it or not.
I can see how that definition of self-interest would lead to some pretty different conclusions about what counts as egoistic behavior.
For sure. And then, of course, you've got hybrid accounts, which try to blend these ideas.
Oh, so it's not like we have to pick one definition and stick with it. We can mix and match a bit.
Exactly. Maybe it's about satisfying certain kinds of desires, those that are also aligned with those objectively good states, like scarfing down that bag of chips, maybe not so good, but satisfying a deep curiosity about, say, astrophysics. That's a desire that also gets you closer to some objective good knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this complex landscape of how to even define self-interest, which, as you can imagine, is going to make things pretty interesting when we start applying it to those three types of egoism.
Oh, yeah, it's about to get real. Fasten your philosophical seatbelts, folks.
So, with that definition groundwork laid, let's jump into the deep end with psychological egoism. This is the one that claims all our actions, no matter how altruistic they seem, are motivated by self-interest.
Right. And I know we touched on this a bit earlier, but it's worth emphasizing just how radical this claim is.
It really is. I
Yeah.
mean, it kind of flies in the face of how we usually think about good deeds, right? Like, if I hold the door open for someone, am I really doing it out of some hidden selfish motive? It seems a bit far-fetched.
I get it. It can feel like a cynical view of human nature. But the psychological egoist has some arguments up their sleeve.
Oh, I'm sure they do. Lay 'em on me. I'm ready for the challenge.
All right. Well, one of the most common arguments they use is just to point to everyday examples of selfish behavior.
So like people cutting in line or hoarding resources or just generally acting in ways that benefit themselves, even if it means stepping on others.
Exactly. They'll say, look around. People are constantly looking out for number one. And even when someone appears to be doing something selfless, there's probably a hidden motive lurking beneath the surface. Like maybe that person who donates a ton of money to charity is secretly hoping for good PR.
Right, or maybe they're just trying to avoid feeling guilty. It's like a self-serving pat on the back, disguised as altruism.
That's the line of thinking. And to be fair, there's definitely something to that. I mean, we've all probably experienced moments where our motivations for doing something good weren't entirely pure.
For sure. But does that mean every seemingly selfless act is just a cleverly disguised act of selfishness? Seems like there has to be more to it than that.
Well, that's where the debate gets really interesting. And to get a better handle on it, we need to look at some of the counter-arguments to psychological egoism, which we'll do after a quick break.
Stay tuned, folks. We're about to delve even deeper into the heart of egoism. Okay, so before the break, we were getting into some pretty heavy territory with psychological egoism and those sneaky hidden motives. But are there any solid arguments against this idea that we're all just self-interested robots in disguise?
There are definitely some powerful counter-arguments, and one of the classics comes from the philosopher Joseph Butler. He argued that you can't get what you want, like enjoying a hockey game, unless you genuinely desire the thing itself, not just the good feelings it produces.
So like, if I only care about my own happiness and hockey just happens to make me happy, I can't actually enjoy the game unless I have a real desire for hockey, not just for happiness itself.
Exactly. Meaning my happiness is, in this case, dependent on a desire that's not selfish, my desire to play hockey.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So it's not as simple as saying I do everything to get a dopamine rush or a sense of satisfaction. Sometimes the means to that end, like playing hockey or, I don't know, helping someone out, have to be desired for their own sake.
Right. It challenges that basic picture the psychological egoist paints that we're always calculating how to maximize pleasure or minimize pain.
Okay, I'm starting to see the cracks in the psychological egoism armor. But what about more extreme cases? Like that classic soldier jumping on a grenade example. How could that possibly be self-interested? They're giving up their life to save others.
That's the million-dollar question, right? Where's the self-interest there? And a psychological egoist might try to explain it away by saying, well, maybe the soldier was deceiving themselves. Or maybe they just couldn't live with the guilt of not sacrificing themselves.
But those explanations start to sound like they're bending over backward to fit the facts to the theory, don't they?
They do. It starts to feel like, are we just making stuff up to rescue this idea that everything has to be selfish at its core?
Exactly. And then there's that other version of psychological egoism, the one that says, whatever you choose to do is, by definition, what you most desired at that moment. So even if you do something really selfless, like donate a kidney to a stranger, they'd say, aha, but that just means you desired to donate that kidney more than anything else.
Yeah, you're catching on, and that's the problem. It's almost like wordplay. It makes psychological egoism kind of empty, right?
Yeah.
Because it takes away any meaningful distinction between selfish and selfless acts, which is what we're actually interested in.
Right? It's like saying water is wet. Okay, so we've got these philosophical objections to psychological egoism, but what about evidence from the real world? Does psychology have anything to say about whether we're all secretly selfish?
It does, and there's some really cool research that throws even more doubt on psychological egoism. For instance, the psychologist Daniel Batson has done a ton of experiments on empathy and helping behavior.
Okay, now we're talking. Love it when psychology and philosophy collide. Tell me more about these experiments.
So, in a nutshell, participants are put in situations where they can help someone who's clearly in distress. But Batson was clever about it. He tested different egoistic explanations for why someone might help.
Like maybe they're trying to avoid feeling bad themselves, right? I hate that awkward feeling when you see someone struggling and you just walk away.
Exactly. Or maybe they just want to look good to others. So Batson set up the experiments to see if those motives, or the purely altruistic one that they genuinely care, were at play.
Okay, drum roll, please. What did he find?
Well, the results repeatedly favored the altruistic explanation. For example, even when participants had a super easy way to avoid feeling bad without helping, they still chose to help if they felt empathy for the person in need.
That's fascinating. So even when you take away the potential self-serving benefits of helping, those empathetic folks still jumped in.
They did. And that's strong evidence against psychological egoism being the whole story. But it gets wilder. There's even an argument against psychological egoism coming from evolutionary biology.
Whoa, wait, hold up. How can altruism, which is about helping others, even at your own expense, be evolutionarily advantageous? Isn't evolution all about survival of the fittest, looking out for number one?
Right, it seems counterintuitive. But the philosophers, Elliot Sober and David Wilson, argue that altruism actually makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint when you think about parental care.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about it. Parents who are consistently dedicated to caring for their offspring, even at a cost to themselves, are more likely to pass on their genes.
Right. Makes sense. A neglectful parent, not so much evolutionary success there.
Exactly. And Sober and Wilson say that altruistic mechanisms for care are more reliable than purely egoistic ones.
I think I'm following.
Yeah.
So a parent who's hardwired to care about their kids' well-being, even if it means some personal cost, is going to be a more consistent and dedicated parent than one who's constantly calculating what's the return on investment for feeding this tiny human.
Precisely. It's like that automatic, I gotta protect this little one instinct leads to better pair, which leads to more kids surviving, which leads to those altruistic genes spreading. Evolution in action.
Wow. Okay, so maybe pure self-interest isn't the only driving force in the evolutionary game? Who knew? But what about folks who are like, okay, maybe not every action is selfish, but people are still pretty selfish most of the time. Where do they stand?
Well, there's a more moderate version of psychological egoism called predominant egoism. This view says that we act unselfishly only rarely. Maybe when the cost to ourselves is super tiny, the benefit to others is huge, or the people we're helping are really close to us, like our kids.
So it's like, yeah, those moments of true altruism might exist, like that soldier on the grenade, but most of the time, it's self-interest calling the shots.
Right, and that version is definitely harder to refute, but it also concedes that pure altruism is at least possible.
Okay, so psychological egoism, we've really put it through the ringer. What's next on this wild egoism ride?
Let's shift gears and tackle ethical egoism. This one's a doozy. It says you're not just allowed to be selfish, you're morally obligated to act in your own self-interest. Period.
Whoa, okay, that's taking things to a whole other level. It sounds like a recipe for, well, a pretty chaotic and selfish world, but I'm guessing ethical egoism has its defenders.
It does. Surprisingly, one interesting thing about ethical egoism, even though it sounds all me, is that it can lead to certain duties towards others.
Wait, seriously, how does that work? I thought the whole point was you don't have to care about anyone but yourself.
Well, think about it this way. For an ethical egoist to get many of the things they want, safety, friendships, a functioning economy, they need others to cooperate.
Ah, I'm starting to see it. So if I'm constantly screwing people over to get what I want, nobody's going to want to play ball with me. I'll end up isolated, worse off. It's like enlightened self-interest or something.
Exactly. Ethical egoism isn't necessarily advocating for being a jerk all the time. They just say, well, the ultimate reason behind my cooperative actions is still that it benefits me in the long run.
Okay, that's kind of clever, I have to admit. But surely there are situations where this cooperation argument just falls apart,
Right.
right? What about cases where there's zero chance of payback, no long-term benefit to being nice?
You're right to point that out. The classic example here is that drowning person dilemma. I see someone struggling in the water. I could easily save them. Most ethical systems would say, duty calls, jump in. But what's the ethical egoist to do?
Yeah, there's no guarantee that person will ever repay the favor or become some valuable ally down the road. So it seems like from a purely selfish perspective, keep walking, pal, might be the most rational choice. Harsh, but
That's the pickle ethical egoism gets into. They might try to argue, well, saving them could lead to good publicity, or I'd feel too guilty if I didn't, and guilt's unpleasant. But come on, at that point, are we really stretching the definition of self-interest to make it fit?
we are. And that's one reason why ethical egoism, even if it's logically consistent, can seem so out of whack with our normal sense of morality. Most folks would say, we have some duty to help those in need, even if it costs us, right?
Absolutely. That's a key difference between ethical egoism and more traditional moral theories. Like, how do they rank the importance of different duties?
Well, I think most systems would say duties that benefit others, especially in a big way, are more important than ones that just benefit you. Like, feeding a starving family is more morally valuable than, I don't know, spending the afternoon perfecting your golf swing,
Yeah.
even if you really love golf.
Exactly. But the ethical egoist would say, nope, it's all about what gives me the biggest payoff, regardless of what it means for others.
So they're constantly running a cost-benefit analysis with themselves at the center.
You got it. And that brings us to another challenge for ethical egoism.
Mm.
Large sacrifices, like that soldier jumping on the grenade. Most moral systems would say, that's heroic, the ultimate act of selflessness. But how does ethical egoism even make sense of that?
It can't. Right, there's no conceivable long-term self-interest. Poof, the soldier's gone. No chance for any reward.
Exactly. The cooperation argument falls apart completely. Now, some really clever ethical egoists might say, hold on, I can adopt a different moral system, like utilitarianism, but for purely self-interested reasons.
Whoa, hold up. Now that's just playing with words, isn't it? How can you be an egoist who converts to another system if you're only doing it to benefit yourself?
Right. It's a tricky move. They might say, well, acting like a utilitarian, even if I don't believe it, might be advantageous. People like me more. Less guilt.
But isn't that like a super shaky foundation for moral behavior?
Yeah.
It's like, I'll be good until it's not convenient anymore.
That's the worry, right? It seems unlikely you could truly commit to a non-egoistic moral system if your heart's not in it. The mask would slip eventually.
So ethical egoism has some issues, to put it mildly. Are there any convincing arguments for this radical view?
There are a couple that pop up often. One is what you might call the common sense morality argument. Ethical egoists will point out that lots of our everyday moral judgments seem to fit pretty well with egoistic principles.
I can see that. Like keeping promises, being honest in business, those are often in our self-interest too, right? They build trust and reputation, which can benefit you down the line.
Exactly. So they'll say, see, ethical egoism captures these common sense moral bits better than other theories, like utilitarianism, which might ask us to sacrifice our own good for the greater good.
But haven't we already seen that ethical egoism fails to capture other moral judgments we hold just as strongly? Like that duty to help someone in need, even if there's no reward for you.
Bingo. You're right. It's a cherry-picking kind of argument. Picks the examples that fit and ignores the ones that don't.
Okay, so that one's not so strong. What's their other go-to argument?
The motivation argument. And guess what? This one depends on psychological egoism being true.
Oh boy, back to square one. So we're assuming all actions are ultimately self-interest.
Yep. And the argument goes, if that's true, then only egoistic moral judgments can actually motivate us to act. Any other kind of moral judgment would be impossible to follow because it'd be asking us to act against our own self-interest, which we supposedly can't do.
So it's like, even if there were some higher moral law telling us to be selfless, we'd be psychologically incapable of obeying it.
That's the idea. But of course, the big issue here is that, as we've discussed, psychological egoism itself is shaky.
Right. If there's even a chance for genuine altruism, this whole argument falls apart. It's built on a foundation of sand.
Exactly. Which brings us to the final stop on our egoism tour, rational egoism.
All right, hit me with it. Psychological and ethical, we've tackled them. What fresh puzzles does rational egoism have for us? Okay, so rational egoism. We've explored those deep, dark waters of psychological egoism, wrestled with those moral quandaries of ethical egoism. Where does rational egoism fit in? Some kind of philosophical middle ground.
It's a little different, actually. Rational egoism isn't really about what's morally right or wrong, you see. It's more about what you have the best reason to do. Less about being a good person, more about being a smart one, at least as far as your own self-interest goes.
Okay, I think I see the distinction you're making. So it's not about following some ethical rule book. It's like, what's the most logically sound decision, given that I ultimately want what's best for me?
You got it. But here's where things get really, really interesting. Rational egoism actually bumps up against this other big idea in philosophy, the what they call the instrumental theory of rationality.
Okay, the instrumental theory. Now, I vaguely remember that from my philosophy 101 days. Refresh my memory. What that all about?
Right. So the instrumental theory, it basically says the most rational choice is always the one that maximizes your preference satisfaction, whatever those preferences happen to be.
So if I prefer to help others, even if it means making sacrifices, wouldn't doing so be the most rational choice, according to that theory? It's like my internal GPS is set to make other people happy, and I'm just following those directions.
Exactly. And that's the tension for rational egoism, you see, because it might actually require you to act against some of your preferences, especially if those preferences aren't directly tied to your own well-being.
Okay, my brain's starting to hurt a little bit. So if I have this strong preference for like donating to charity, even though it means I have less money for myself, rational egoism might say, nope, not the most rational move, even if it feels right.
Yeah, that's the potential conflict. And it leads to one of the biggest objections against rational egoism, this charge of arbitrariness. Critics will say, why should your self-interest be the deciding factor? What makes you so special? If any preference can justify action, doesn't the instrumental theory win out?
Yeah, I could see that. It's like saying, out of all the billions of people on this planet, my self-interest is the only one that really matters when making decisions. Sounds a bit, well, self-centered. Even if it's rational self-centeredness.
Right. So the rational egoists, they can have a good response to that. One way they try to defend themselves is by appealing back to that idea of preferences. They'll say, hey, my preference for my own well-being, that's just as valid as any other preference, right? It's not arbitrary. It's just a basic fact about me. Like, I prefer chocolate over vanilla. What can I say?
Okay, but don't we often judge preferences, like
Yeah.
on whether they're reasonable or not? If someone says, I prefer to discriminate against people with blue eyes, we don't just shrug and say, hey, their preference.
Hmm.
So the rational egoist can't just say, well, I prefer my own well-being. So there's
Yeah.
there's got to be more to it than that.
Totally. It's not that simple.
Oh.
Another defense they use is to say that certain distinctions are just fundamentally non-arbitrary. And the line between me and everyone else, that's one of them. It's built in, you know?
So they might say, it's just self-evident that I care more about my existence than the existence of some random stranger. That's just how it is. No further justification needed.
Exactly. And that was an argument made by the philosopher Henry Sidgwick. He said, look, it's just common sense that we're more concerned with our own survival, our own flourishing, than that of others. And this basic fact, he said, should be the foundation for making rational choices.
But other philosophers, especially like utilitarians, they would push back hard on that, right? They'd say, why stop at the individual? Why not expand your circle of concern to include your family, your community, all sentient beings? Where do you draw the line?
Exactly. It gets messy fast. So even if Sidgwick's argument is kind of appealing in its simplicity, it seems like it raises more questions than it answers. And this is where things get even more complex, especially when we start thinking about, wait for it, our future selves.
Oh, okay, now we're getting into some seriously mind-bending stuff. How does rational egoism deal with the whole future selves concept? Because that seems slippery. Like, who even is my future self?
Well, the rational egoist would say, look, the time at which a benefit happens, that's irrelevant. So I should be just as willing to make a small sacrifice now for a bigger reward later, even if that future me feels a bit different than me sitting here today.
Makes sense, right? We save for retirement, we invest in education, go to the gym when we'd rather be eating pizza, all because we think those actions will benefit some future version of ourselves.
Exactly. But here comes Derek Parfit, this super influential philosopher, and he basically threw a giant wrench into this whole way of thinking about future selves.
Parfit. Okay, he's the guy with all the crazy thought experiments,
Yeah.
right? I know the name, but the details are fuzzy.
You got it. Parfit is famous for these mind-blowing thought experiments, really making us question our assumptions about identity, about continuity. And one of his big critiques of rational egoism involves something called the present aim theory of rationality.
The present aim theory. Okay, that's a new one. I'm all ears. What in the world is that?
All right, so this might sound a bit out there, but stick with me. The present aim theory basically says that the most rational choice, it's always the one that satisfies your current desires, even if those desires clash with what your future self might want. It's like your present self is a tiny dictator ruling over all your future selves.
So if my present self was like, give me that giant slice of chocolate cake, even though I know future me is going to regret those extra calories tomorrow, present aim theory is like, go for it, indulge, present desires win.
Exactly. Now, why does this matter for rational egoism? Because it's like an even more basic, more minimal view of rationality. The rational egoist can't just say, my theory is the most fundamental, the most stripped down, if something like present aim theory is out there.
So Parfit is using this other theory to like poke holes in the foundations of rational egoism, show it's not as rock solid as it claims to be.
You got it. But wait, there's more. He also argued that the way rational egoists think about future selves, it's flawed. And for this, he used these wild thought experiments about, are you ready for this? Brain splitting.
Brain splitting. Okay, now we're really going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
From hockey to soldiers to chocolate cake, and now we're splitting brains. Where are you taking me?
I know, it's a trip. But trust me, it's worth it. So picture this. Half of your brain gets transplanted into a brand new body, and the old body is destroyed. This new person, they have all your memories, your personality, everything that makes you you. We'd probably call them you, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. It's like you just got a new body, but the you part is still there.
Okay, now imagine both halves of your brain are transplanted into two different bodies. Same deal, both have your memories, personality, the works. Are both these new people you?
Ooh, now that's getting tricky. They can't both be me, right? Because there's two of them. So it seems like personal identity, that's not the only thing that matters when it comes to how we think about, how we care about our future selves.
That's Parfit's point. He argued what really matters is the psychological continuity, that connection of memories, beliefs, values, all that stuff. And if that's the case, then we don't necessarily have some super special obligation to all our future selves.
Because some of them might be so different, psychologically, that they're practically strangers.
Exactly. And on the flip side, we might have a reason to care about other people in the present who are psychologically connected to us, even if they're not technically part of ourself. And this really throws a wrench into the whole rational egoist idea that focus on your own self-interest. That's always the most rational move.
Wow, Parfit's really shaking things up.
Mm-hmm.
But can the rational egoist come back from this? Are there any counter-arguments? You can't just give up, right?
Of course not. There's tons of debate about Parfit's thought experiments, whether they really demolish rational egoism. Some philosophers argue, hey, maybe psychological continuity, that can stand in for identity. You still have that special obligation to those future selves, even if they've changed a lot.
So it's like saying, even if I'm not literally the same person I was 10 years ago, there's enough overlap, mentally and emotionally, that I still owe something to that future me.
That's one way to look at it, but there are other criticisms of rational egoism that go beyond this whole future self puzzle. Like A.C. Ewing, this philosopher, he argued, look, even if we say self-interest is a reason to act, it's just weird to think it's the only reason, right?
Right. It's like saying, sure, I care about my own well-being, but that doesn't mean I can't also care about other things. Justice, beauty, the happiness of others. It doesn't all have to be about me.
Exactly. And even evolutionary theory, believe it or not, has something to say about this. There's this argument called the evolutionary debunking argument, which is kind of controversial, but it does raise some interesting points.
Okay, we're back to evolution. How does that fit in the picture?
Well, it's like this. If believing in rational egoism makes people more reproductively successful, helps them have more kids who survive, regardless of whether it's actually true, then that belief starts to look a little suspect.
It's like saying, if evolution has wired me to believe something that helps me survive, even if that belief is a total lie, maybe I shouldn't trust it so blindly.
Exactly. It's saying our beliefs might be shaped by forces that have nothing to do with truth or rationality. Now, there's a whole debate about whether this argument really works, whether it applies to other moral theories as well, but it definitely raises some questions about the foundations of rational egoism.
Okay, so Wow, we've journeyed through this whole landscape of egoism, psychological, ethical, rational, and it seems like each one's got some pretty big question marks hanging over it. Not exactly a slam dunk for egoism.
That's right. Those big claims, all actions are self-interested, we should always be selfish, rationality is always and only about self-interest, they all have some serious flaws. But even if egoism doesn't hold up as a perfect philosophical system, exploring it is super valuable. It makes us think about our motives, our assumptions about what's rational, what's moral, how we relate to our future selves, all that good stuff.
Totally. So even if we don't end up embracing egoism as our own personal philosophy, understanding it deeply like we've done today, that's crucial. It helps us understand, human behavior, ethical debates, all those big questions.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with this thought-provoking question. Are there any situations where acting entirely in one's own self-interest, is it ever truly the most rational choice? Or even the most moral one?
That's the question, isn't it? And there might not be an easy answer, but wrestling with these questions, that's what philosophy is all about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, listener. We'll see you next time for more philosophical adventures.